34. I refused to wash my Amish husband's boots. One Sunday, he took them to the bishop. I still have them. That is the first thing I want you to understand. After everything that happened, after the bishop's visit, after the community meeting, after the silence that followed me like a second shadow for the better part of 2 years, I kept the boots. Not out of sentiment. Not because I forgave what was done with them. I kept them because they are the only honest record of what my marriage actually was, and I am not ready to let that record disappear. They sit in a cedar box at the back of my closet now. I am 51 years old. I have not opened that box in several months. But I know exactly what I would find if I did. A pair of black work boots, size 11, with a crack along the left heel that my husband, Eli, always said he would have repaired and never did. The leather on the toe of the right boot is scuffed down to something pale and raw-looking. The laces have been replaced once, with the wrong color brown. I was 23 years old when I first held those boots in my hands. I was 26 when I refused to touch them. In between those 3 years, I learned things about marriage, about community, about the kind of obedience that does not feel like obedience until the day you finally stop. My name is Sarah. I grew up in a district in eastern Ohio, in the community where I was baptized and married, and where I expected, without ever seriously questioning it, to spend the rest of my life. The people who raised me were not cruel. I want to say that clearly. My father was a quiet man with enormous hands, and a habit of humming hymns while he worked. My mother was precise and capable, and loved us in the way that left no room for doubt, even when it left very little room for conversation. I had 2 brothers and a younger sister, and we lived in a white farmhouse set back from a gravel road, and for the first 22 years of my life, I considered myself fortunate. Eli Brenneman came into my life the way most things came into my life back then. Arranged by the community before I had formed a clear opinion of my own. His family was well regarded. His father had served as a deacon. Eli himself was considered steady, responsible, and appropriately devout. He was 28 when we began the courtship that had been quietly agreed upon by our families, and he had a way of speaking that sounded like certainty. Not arrogance, certainty, as though he had already decided how things would go, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. I told myself I admired that quality. For a while, I believed it. We were married in November, the month of my 23rd year. The wedding was held at my parents' home on a gray Thursday morning, and 240 people came, and there was more food than anyone could eat, and my mother pressed my hand once before the ceremony, and said something I did not fully understand until much later. She said, "Learn quickly what matters to him, Sarah. It will save you trouble." I thought she was telling me to be a good wife. It took me 3 years to understand she was telling me something else entirely. The boots appeared on the 3rd morning of our marriage. Eli set them by the back door the evening before, and I noticed them but said nothing. We were still learning the geography of the house, what belonged where, what routines he had already built before I arrived. The following morning, while he was outside attending to the horses, I found his mother, Ruth, standing in my kitchen. She was a short woman with narrow eyes and a quality of stillness that I had initially mistaken for gentleness. She pointed to the boots without preamble. "He'll want those cleaned before church," she said. "The polish is in the drawer by the pantry." I assumed this was a new wife instruction, the kind of practical guidance that gets passed between women in our community as a matter of course. I found the polish. I cleaned the boots. They came out looking well, and Eli noticed without making a point of it, and the day proceeded without incident. I did not think about it again for nearly 4 months. By March of that first year, I had begun to understand the shape of our household. Eli was not a man who expressed expectations loudly. He expressed them through silence and through routine. If something was done incorrectly, he would simply wait until it was corrected, his patience taking on a quality that felt, over time, more like pressure than forbearance. The boot cleaning had become a Sunday ritual, without either of us ever directly naming it as such. Every Saturday night, his boots sat by the back door. Every Sunday morning, I cleaned them before he came in for breakfast. It was one task among dozens, no more significant on the surface than any other. But I noticed, sometime around the 4th month, that the boots were always left in the same position, toes pointing toward the door, laces loosened to the fourth eyelet, no further, and always on a Saturday, never a weekday, no matter how muddy the week had been. His weekday boots he cleaned himself, quickly, and without ceremony. The Sunday boots were mine. I filed that observation away, and told myself it meant nothing. The first strange detail arrived, in the form of a conversation I was not meant to hear. It was a Sunday in late spring, a warm one, the windows open during the afternoon visiting hour. Ruth had come for the midday meal, as she did most Sundays, and she and Eli sat together on the porch while I washed dishes inside. Their voices carried more clearly than they realized. I caught only a fragment. Ruth was speaking, her voice lower than usual. She said something I could not fully catch, and then, distinctly, his father expected the same. It kept things ordered. Eli said nothing I could hear clearly. There was a pause, then Ruth again. A wife who keeps the boots keeps the house. I set down the plate I was holding and stood very still. I did not know what to do with those words, so I did what I had learned to do with things that unsettled me in those early months. I set them aside. I finished the dishes. When Ruth left that afternoon, I smiled at the door and went back inside and said nothing. But the sentence stayed with me. A wife who keeps the boots keeps the house. It had the sound of something that had been said before, many times, in many rooms. It had the sound of a rule that no one had thought to explain to me, because no one had imagined I might need the explanation. By the second year of our marriage, I had come to understand something that I still find difficult to describe precisely. The boot cleaning was not simply a chore. It was a weekly demonstration, and the demonstration was not for Eli's benefit alone. On the Sundays when the congregation gathered at neighboring homes, I had begun to notice the way certain women looked at one another. A shared glance over a supper dish, a nod across the room that contained information I couldn't quite read. There was a language being spoken that I had grown up around without ever being formally taught, and the boots, clean, polished, set by the door on time, were part of that language. They said, "This house is in order. This wife knows her place. This marriage is sound." I mentioned this to my mother once, during a visit in the summer of my second year. I did not describe the feeling fully. I only said that I sometimes felt as though the Sundays meant something more than I understood. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All marriages have their customs, Sarah. Did you clean father's boots?" I asked. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not quite guilt. It was something more complicated. Something that understood a question without wanting to answer it. "I did," she said, and then she changed the subject. I drove home that evening feeling more alone than I had on the drive there. The second clue came in the winter of my third year, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Hannah Yoder. Hannah was older than me by perhaps 12 years, a widow whose husband had died of a lung illness, and she lived 2 properties down from ours. She was not the kind of woman who drew attention, but she had a quality of directness that I found, in those years, both frightening and necessary. We were both at a quilting gathering in February, when she sat down beside me and asked, with no particular softness, how I was keeping. I said I was well. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Eli's first wife wasn't." I felt the room rearrange itself around me. I had known, in the abstract way, you know things that have been mentioned once and not elaborated upon, that Eli had been briefly married before. His first wife, a woman named Clara, had left the community when their marriage was less than a year old. I had never been told why. Eli had mentioned her name exactly once, on the night before our wedding, as a fact being disclosed rather than a conversation being invited. I had understood, correctly, that it was not a subject to be revisited. "What do you mean?" I asked Hannah. She looked down at her quilting. "Clara stopped cleaning his boots in October. By December she was gone." She said nothing else. After a moment, she moved to another seat, and we did not speak of it again that day. But I sat with my needle in my hand, and my work in my lap, and understood, for the first time, that the boots were not simply a Sunday custom. They were a test, one that had been administered before. I spent the remaining months of winter trying to reconcile that understanding with the life I was living. I cleaned the boots. I went to church. I sat beside Eli in the pew and folded my hands and sang the hymns I had sung since childhood, and I waited to understand what I was waiting for. What I had not yet grasped was this: the boots were not simply a test of compliance, they were a record of it. And the record was maintained not only by Eli, but by the community around us. I understood this fully on a Sunday in early March, when Deacon Hirschberger's wife, a woman named Miriam, paused beside me after the service and asked whether I was managing the household well. Her tone was pleasant, her eyes were not. "Well enough," I said. "Eli speaks highly of your order," she said. And then, glancing briefly downward, "Clean boots on a Sunday say a great deal about a family." She smiled. She moved on, and I stood in the March cold outside that house and understood, finally and completely, that those boots were not mine to clean, or not clean. They had never been. They belonged to an agreement that had been made without me, by people who considered the agreement more important than the person inside it. That was the Sunday I began to think about refusing. I did not refuse immediately. That is important to understand. I thought about it for nearly 4 months. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn something fragile, slowly, carefully, afraid of what you will find on the other side. I had no plan. I had no ally I trusted completely. Hannah Yoder had given me information, but she had not offered me direction. My mother had given me a look across a kitchen table that I was still decoding. What I had was a growing certainty that cleaning those boots one more Sunday would mean something I could not afford to let it mean. Not because the act itself was unbearable, but because by that point I understood what I was agreeing to every time I knelt down and put the brush to the leather. I was agreeing that the assessment of my marriage by the people around us mattered more than my own understanding of what was happening inside it. I was agreeing that silence was the same as peace. The Sunday I refused was in late July, the summer of my 26th year. It was hot, and the air in the kitchen was thick, and Eli came in from the barn and looked at his boots by the door, and then looked at me. I was standing at the counter. I did not move. "They need cleaning," he said. "I know," I said. He waited. I had learned, over 3 years, to read the quality of his waiting. This was a different kind than I had encountered before. This was not the pressure patience of routine expectation. This was something I can only describe as assessment. He was measuring something. "You're going to leave them," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. He picked up the boots. He held them for a moment, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something unreadable and very still. Then he set them down on the table, sat in the kitchen chair, and cleaned them himself, slowly and without speaking. He put them on. He went to church. I went beside him. But that afternoon, after the service, he walked to the bishop's house with the boots still on his feet. I did not know that was where he had gone until his mother appeared at my door before supper. "You've made trouble," Ruth said. She did not come inside. "I didn't clean his boots," I said. "Bishop Kaufman will come Tuesday," she said. And she left. Bishop Kaufman came on Tuesday morning, as promised. He was a large man, deliberate in his movements, with a gray beard and an air of authority that had always seemed, when I was a child, to come from God rather than from the man himself. I had grown by then, enough to understand the distinction. He sat at my table. He accepted the coffee I offered. He spoke for some time about the importance of order in a household, about the way small acts of faithfulness communicated the condition of a marriage to the community that sustained it. He spoke about Clara, which surprised me. He used her name plainly, as a precedent. She struggled with submission, he said. It led her away from everything that could have held her. "Did her boots come to you too?" I asked. He looked at me carefully. "Eli came to me," he said, "as a husband concerned for the order of his home." "And what did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I would speak with you," he said. "And I am speaking with you." There was a long silence. The coffee sat between us, cooling. "I'm not Clara," I said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But the outcome of that path is known to both of us." He left an hour later. I stood at the window and watched his buggy move down the gravel road, and I thought about the boots sitting in their cedar box in my mind. Not yet real, not yet kept, but already becoming something I would carry out of that house. I did not leave that Tuesday. I left 4 months later, in November, on the second anniversary of our wedding. I told Eli on a Monday morning, calmly, while the coffee was still warm. I told him I was going to stay with my sister in Indiana, and that I would not be returning. He did not argue. He looked at me with that unreadable stillness for a long moment, and then he said, "You were never going to be able to do this." I have thought about that sentence many times in the years since. I have come to believe he was wrong about what he meant and correct about what he said. The shunning lasted 14 months. My parents struggled with it in different ways. My father by working harder and speaking less. My mother by sending me letters that were careful and loving, and never quite said what I needed them to say. My sister in Indiana held me accountable to nothing, and asked nothing of me but time, and I will love her for that until I am no longer capable of love. I found my way. It was slow, and it was not graceful, and there were seasons of it I do not wish to revisit. But I found it. Eli remarried within 2 years. I learned this through my sister, who learned it through a cousin. I do not know whether his third wife cleans his boots on Sunday mornings. I do not know whether she understands what she is agreeing to when she does. I hope someone told her. I hope she knows the language well enough to read it. The boots came to me in an unexpected way. When I collected my belongings from the house, Eli had set most of them by the door in 2 wooden crates, neatly arranged. Beneath the second crate, placed there deliberately enough that I had to move the crate to retrieve my things, were the boots. His Sunday boots. The ones I had refused. I have thought often about why he left them. I do not believe it was cruelty, exactly. I believe it was a final assertion that the boots were mine, in the end, because I had made them significant. They were the evidence of my failure to comply, and he wanted me to carry that with me. What he did not anticipate was that I would come to understand them differently. I put them in the cedar box that evening. I have moved 4 times since then, and the cedar box has come with me every time, not because I need to see them, but because they are the truest record I have of what I cost myself to understand, and what I gained by understanding it anyway. There is a crack along the left heel that he always said he would repair. In 28 years, I do not think he ever did. Some things are easier to leave broken than to kneel down and tend to. I learned that, eventually, in the least comfortable way possible, but I learned it.